Welcome to ETF.com University, where we demystify the world of ETFs. My name is Dave Nottig, Managing Director here at ETF.com. In this next series of videos, we're going to walk through all of the major asset classes and try to highlight what unique or interesting due diligence questions come up when you're looking in that space. Today, we're going to talk about what some people might think is the most boring part of the market, plain old equities. But honestly, I think there's some very interesting questions to ask about equity funds, particularly indexed funds and smart beta, and I want to highlight some of those. First, we should point out this is a big part of the market, and it's really where ETFs started. The first ETF in the US was the Spider S&P 500 Trust, SPY, and the next batch of ETFs were the World Equity Benchmark Shares, or WEBs, which were country funds that eventually became the BlackRock iShares series of ETFs. Today, there are over 700 US equity ETFs with a total of over $2 trillion in assets, and almost 600 international equity ETFs with another 750 billion or so in assets. In other words, this is a huge part of the market, and it can get confusing. So how do you think about equities? Well, I'm going to assume that you've watched some of the other videos in this series where we talk about the basics of evaluating funds. So you've limited your selection to that group of funds that you believe are tradable and efficient at delivering their strategy. So what's left? Well, honestly, exposure. When it comes to equity exposure, almost all of the interesting differences between funds come down to the choices that the index provider has made about what kind of exposure to get. To me, the best example for this is what I call the South Korea problem. Put simply, not everyone agrees whether or not South Korea is a developed market or an emerging market. And that disagreement means that you, as an investor, really have to have an opinion. Here's the country breakdown of two of the biggest, most popular emerging markets ETFs, Vanguard's VWO and BlackRock's EEM. Now, VWO follows a FTSE Russell benchmark, and so it skips South Korea altogether because FTSE classifies the country as a developed market. EEM, on the other hand, follows an MSCI benchmark, which includes South Korea. That's a huge 12% position at the country level that's in one fund and not in the other. Any difference in performance between those two funds is necessarily going to be absolutely determined by how Korea performs. So if you're looking at emerging markets funds, you don't get to not have an opinion because simply by choosing one of these funds versus the other, you're making a call. So while Korea might be the biggest, simplest example, it's hardly the only one. Let's pick the most well-trod territory in equities, US large cap exposure. It's easy to think that these are all just different flavors or variations of vanilla. I don't think anybody would suggest, when you think about it, that an index holding 350 stocks would be exactly the same as an index that's holding 1,000. I mean, the names are right there. The differences are right in the name. But it is reasonable to ask how much this really matters. I mean, after all, the Russell 1000 and the S&P 500 perform quite similarly in most markets because they're both capitalization weighted. So they get lots and lots of exposure to Apple and Microsoft, but teeny tiny slivers of, say, Macy's and HR Block. But where it matters is when you start combining funds. So imagine that you use the S&P 500 for your large cap exposure and the Russell 2000 for your small cap exposure. That's a pretty common thing. But between the smallest stock in the S&P 500 and the largest stock in the Russell 2, there are 500 companies, which by definition, you've completely missed. If instead you'd used, say, a Russell 1000 ETF for your large cap exposure, well, now you've pieced together your own customized version of really total market exposure. And you could adjust allocations cleanly between those two. This issue of rolling up smaller, narrower indexes into a larger, cohesive total market becomes even more important when you start thinking about smart beta or factor funds. I get asked all the time what I think of value funds versus growth funds in different market environments, and I kind of always have to reply the same way, which is, what do you mean by growth? What do you mean by value? I mean, consider the 4 big index providers and their approach to growth here. They have radically different inputs, which means you'll get radically different sets of stocks, different portfolios. And those methodologies are actually designed to work in coordination with other factors in the same series: value, momentum, quality. This chart from Style Analytics, for instance, looks at the 10 large cap growth ETFs, the biggest ones, and it measures their real factor exposures versus the broad market using Style Analytics' own methodology. And you can see that there's an enormous difference here, even inside the growth metrics. And in fact, some of the growth ETFs seem to have negative growth exposure, but all of them have a little bit of stealth momentum in the mix too. Here's value, and it's a little bit more homogeneous. The top 10 large cap value funds at least look like they've all got value exposure. But then I think the next question is really, how much is this going to matter? As an example, I took the highest scoring value ETF from this and I deconstructed its exposure to see where its real risk was coming from, what bets it was really making. And for sure, there's some value exposure here, about 8 or 9% of the risk, but there's also exposure to countless other factors which just come along for the ride. So what's the takeaway here? Well, as always, you do need to look under the hood. You need to look at that exposure, but consistency is also really important. If you're using, say, MSCI-based factor products, don't mix it in with a FTSE-based value fund. Or if you're using a FTSE Russell exposure for small cap, consider using that for your other exposures as well. If you don't keep this kind of index purity, well, you run the risk of either missing whole sections of the market, or perhaps even more worryingly, you end up doubling up on certain exposures by accident, kind of without even trying. And that can lead to some pretty unpleasant surprises. I hope this has helped give you a sense of why it's important to continue to look under the hood for your equity exposure, and why even plain vanilla funds still have some interesting questions that need to be answered. Thank you for listening. Hope you'll join us next time.